Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm Ahval editor David Lepeska, and joining me today is Kyle Orton, independent Syria and terrorism analyst. Hello, Kyle, and welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. We're speaking on Tuesday, the final day of the 5-day ceasefire deal, which Turkish President Erdoğan and Russian President Putin are sure to discuss at their meeting in Sochi later today. The Kurdish-led militia known as the SDF, or YPG, is supposed to have withdrawn by today from all areas along the Syrian border with Turkey, according to the U.S.-Turkey ceasefire deal. But top Kurdish officials have in recent days expressed their commitment to the previous U.S.-Turkey safe zone plan, which required SDF withdrawal from only the Tal Abyad Ras Al Ain area, not from areas like Kobane and Jazeera. So it seems we're now at a bit of a standoff in northeast Syria, which likely puts even more pressure on this Erdoğan-Putin meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, it seems so. I think everyone kind of knew that this meeting was going to be probably more determining of things than the American ceasefire. I mean, the problem is with the Americans on the way out, their leverage is actually really minimal. And so everyone is kind of making their calculations without the Americans there. There's still a kind of political significance to it, because I mean, even a few American troops in an area are going to be protected by American air power. So that is a consideration for everybody. And the Russians have tried once or twice to run that gauntlet, and it didn't end well for them. So they're not going to do that again. But once the Americans are determined to leave, everyone's just in a sense waiting. And the PKK, the SDF or YPG, whatever they call themselves, I think we're hoping to cut a deal with the Russians as well. So yeah, I mean, this meeting I think could determine things on the ground more than the ceasefire, which, as you say, didn't. I mean, the overall ceasefire deal has not taken place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu on Sunday said that Ankara and Moscow would address the removal of the YPG from Kobane and other areas during the Sochi talks. What do you expect to come out of the meeting between the Russian and Turkish presidents today? I'm hearing that the deal is likely to satisfy Putin's desire to solidify the Assad regime and satisfy Turkey's desire to further uproot or destroy the YPG, but further details seem to remain completely up in the air.
Yeah, as with so much on these things, it's sort of everyone's going to get what they want, details to follow. So we'll see. I think that the Kobane thing, it's likely, it seems, that the regime will return to this area rather than Turkey. I'm not sure Turkey even really wants to hold Kobane or Kamishli, because they know that they would face protracted trouble doing so.
But it doesn't have SDF YPG presence in those areas either, which there seems to still be.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to know what will happen, because I mean the overall trend is that the PKK is going to get folded back into its old position as a sort of instrument of Damascus and Russia. But that process, I think, because the PKK is so much more powerful now than it was at the beginning of this, because of American weaponry and money and training and things, that there will be a period where Damascus and Moscow are asserting themselves over it and sort of teaching the PKK to come to heel. And I think taking Kobane may be one of the ways that happens. But the Turks, I think, are quite happy for the pro-Assad coalition to take some of these areas. Put it this way, they'd rather the pro-Assad coalition than the PKK on their border. So if that's the solution that they come up with, or that's the proposal that's put forward, I think that the Turks would go for it.
On Monday, Trump committed to keep some 200 U.S. troops in eastern Syria in order to, as he says, protect Kurd-controlled oil fields.
Right.
Many analysts have responded that the Kurds will likely be unable to get the support of Russia and Syria if they're still working with U.S. troops. What do you think?
I think that's right. I'm actually, you may be further ahead than me in the news here, but I don't know that actually even got presented to Trump. I know that this was leaked by some people from the Pentagon, that this was being proposed, but there was some reporting later that he hadn't actually even seen these options yet. it's the problem with it is that it's obviously an attempt to keep the Americans in Syria, keep the American troops in Syria, and to carry out a mission that's really not related to the oil. But it's being presented to Trump as an oil thing because he's previously said we should have taken the oil. And they sort of, but the bureaucracy keeps doing this, where they try to find a pretext to keep the US in, and then try to run an expansive mission in Syria. And then obviously eventually it turns out you can't do an expansive mission with whatever minimal force they've got. So they start trying to push for more resources, and then Trump realizes what's happening and demands a pullout. And we've been through this twice now. And
I was just going to say, I mean, at least twice in the past few weeks, Trump has appeared to give Erdoğan what he's asked for, the U.S. ending ties to the YPG, PKK, only to take it back. Erdoğan must be a bit unhappy with this decision, even if it is the Pentagon kind of working a way around the White House.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it strengthens both Trump's belief and I think Erdogan's that there's this deep state in the US that does its own thing. So that's an unhelpful factor. But yeah, I think Trump wants out of Syria. For as much as people say, he lies and all this kind of thing, which is not untrue. On this particular issue, he's been really consistent. Like on Syria since late 2015 at the latest, he has said we need to just destroy ISIS and then get out. And that's what he's wanted to do. He's been thwarted twice. Last year in March it was, he made that speech in Ohio, and then in April they managed to pull him round, and then in December. But yeah, Trump, I think, would just like to hand over the whole problem to somebody else.
So what do you think Turkey's response is to him not doing that? I mean, then this seems to be, we never know what's going to happen, but this seems to be for now the final stance of the U.S., 200 troops alongside Kurdish forces.
I think that the Turks are just generally confused. They're, in the sense of, as everybody else is, they just don't know what's happening. They are, as I say, the Turks have always been convinced that CENTCOM is working against them and against the White House. And the last few weeks have provided evidence that that's not an entirely irrational view of the way things are. To the question you asked before about about the 200 troops and the PKK cutting a deal with Damascus, I mean, I think that's obviously true. The thing is, 200 troops could barely defend itself, couldn't really hold the oil fields in a serious sense, so would be reliant on the PKK for its presence. And the PKKs would have no further use for cooperation with the Americans if they can't or won't protect them from Turkey. And in those circumstances, those 200 troops clearly couldn't do that. So the deal they would want to cut would be with Damascus and Russia to bring those forces into the area, which is at least a political barrier, even if it's not a physical one, to Turkey. And so, yeah, I just don't see the U.S. position as sustainable with those few troops.
I mean, I'm no Syrian war expert, but I would guess the intention is to be a deterrent force. Nobody wants to attack U.S. forces, even if it is 200, and an all-out assault on the Kurds would necessitate, putting U.S. troops in danger.
Yeah, I think this is the idea, but I can't see that that would. I mean, to be honest, Ilham Ahmed said this yesterday. That there's no role for the U.S. unless they can prevent Turkey coming in. I think. I mean, if it ended up with like Turkey surrounding everything but the oil field, that would be a loss as much for the PKK as anything else. If they cut a deal with Damascus or Russia now, there's a possibility of some further. They're not going to get to keep autonomy if they get folded back into the regime, but they would maybe keep some light weaponry and this kind of thing, which they just won't, obviously, if Turkey takes over their areas.
Mm-hmm. Also on Monday, Germany's defense minister proposed an internationally controlled safe zone in cooperation with Turkey and Russia to continue the fight against ISIS and create stability to enable voluntary return. I'm assuming this would not be Turkey's preferred solution, but do you see this proposal having any traction?
No, I can't. I don't think anybody wants it. Turkey asked for something like this a while ago, and the US tried to get the Europeans on board to do it. It was more like a buffer zone at that time. It was to put space between the PKK and Turkey inside Syria. But at this point, I mean, Turkey has made its own decision on how these things go. It's coordinating with Russia to essentially take apart the Rojava system. I don't see what role they would see for the Europeans in this. Maybe once it's over, there'll be some kind of peacekeeping need. But as for right now, it just doesn't seem like it would help. And I don't see why the PKK would particularly want them in either, if the intention is to help Turkey and Russia with this carve-up. Or if it's not, then why would Turkey and Russia allow them in to hinder that process that they can otherwise get on with? It's just really unclear who the Germans would be protecting and from whom.
Well, I mean, she didn't say it would be German dominated. I mean, there's
I know what you mean. The European
going to be a continuing U.S. force of at least 200. There are already some British and French troops there. The U.S. doesn't appear to be completely allowing the handover of formerly SDF-held territory. So there seems to be some reasoning for it. But yeah, I mean, I would agree to some extent. Why would Russia and Turkey want this?
Yeah, I just can't see. And the timing of it as well. I mean, by the time they mobilize to do this, the situation would be finished. They would have worked out what they want to do and have gone with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as we talk about the U.S. cutting ties with the SDF or YPG or even PKK, as you prefer to call them, you wrote on your blog last week that Obama's decision to partner with the YPG back in 2014 made all this inevitable.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It was for Arab Weekly, but yeah, I think this is why it's so difficult, because the Turkish incursion is basically indefensible in the sense that it's created a new round of fighting. There's now displacement. The Arab militias they've chosen to use are the remnants of the armed opposition, and they're to still be fighting after 8 years of Assad's tactics, they're the coarser element of the opposition, or they're the ones that are so desperate that they are the most mercenary forces. So it's not you can understand why people are fleeing the areas that they're moving into. So that
we've already seen these roadside executions, possible white phosphorus use. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a grim situation. At the same time, it's just an inevitability. Like, Turkey was never going to be okay with a PKK statelet on its border. It said this. It's not made a secret about this. It told the US this, but the US continued on as if this would become okay, as if Turkey would get used to the idea, or as if I mean, in Western parlance, obviously most people don't accept that the PKK is in fact what this force is, the SDF, and they think that they're not accepting of that means that Turkey won't accept that. But even if you don't accept analytically, I mean, I happen to just think that the Turks are basically correct on this. But even if you don't think that, it's a political fact that Turkey does think that, and always would have.
One thing I didn't see mentioned in the piece, maybe it's in there, was that at the time that Obama aligned with the YPG to battle ISIS, Turkey was also getting into bed with the PKK, inviting PKK and YPG officials to Ankara for talks as part of the peace process. So it's almost understandable if the U.S. saw them, knowing, I'm sure Obama and his administration knew that they were, likely pissing off Turkey, but it's understandable if the U.S. saw the YPG as a potential partner at that time, because Turkey did as well.
I think it's true that there was less hostility at that time, or at least there was this ongoing peace process in Turkey. It's more, though, that the Obama people didn't have that in mind. I mean, their focus was Iran, or that was the coloring to their decisions. They'd stood down from the red line in the August of 2013 because they didn't want to upset Assad, because that would have upset Iran and scuppered the interim deal, as it then was, that came out, I think, a few months later. It was November 2013, the interim deal. So by the time they came to 2014, I mean, the initial bit was quite ad hoc. It was a case of they saved Kobani because it was, in a sense, a thing to do. They changed course over about 10 days, because they initially said saving Kobani isn't part of our program and it would be terrible if it falls, but it's not a strategic objective of ours. And then they changed course, and by
US,
the US. So it was, Kerry made a statement. If my memory serves, it was on October the 8th of 2014, saying it's just nothing to do with us. Like, as tragic as it would be if Kobani falls, it's nothing to do with us. But by October 20, they changed their mind and said no, saving the city is part of the program. And they came in and did it. They'd already started the airlift and the airstrikes around Sinjar, which the PKK had broken the siege of the mountain. So there was a kind of ad hocery to the initial part of it. But then they started expanding out from there, and and taking over these territories. And by then, it was a conscious choice of who to support. Because the problem is, if it was so urgent, like if that's the argument for it, is that it was just an urgent thing, so you had to work with whoever was to hand. Well, if it's that urgent, you would send in American troops. And if the argument is for durability, for a solution that's sustainable, then you have to cultivate a local and locally legitimate force to hold the area once ISIS is gone. And that means, you have to build that even if it's not present, if you want to form something that's actually going to work over the long term. So the use of the PKK to expand into, the use of the PKK in Kurdish areas is dubious enough because they represent only a minority even among Kurds, but it was to have them occupy Arab areas was an indefensible decision in that way. But
two good reasons, though, for choosing them. It was urgent, and they were at hand, and it's a local force that could help after, which they've done in terms of watching ISIS prisoners.
For the US, it served their interest because it meant they didn't have to sacrifice troops, and the PKK isn't opposed to Iran. So it was, and isn't opposed to the Assad coalition. It didn't. Whereas the rebels would have insisted, the rebels would have insisted on US help to help fight the Assad regime, but more than that, it would have been any rebel force would have needed protection from the Assad regime. So the US would have been drawn into a collision directly. And working with the PKK meant that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm. So it was understandable from the US perspective, but understandable that Turkey was never going to accept it.
Right. It was just a clash of interests.
Syria analyst Aaron Lund on Sunday tweeted his view of where northeast Syria is headed, highlighting a Turkey-controlled safe zone from Tal Abyad to Ras Al Ain, and Syria-controlled safe zones on either side of that around Kobani and Jazeera, with Ankara talking to Moscow about clearing YPG from those regime-controlled areas. Does this sound like likely possible outcome to you?
I think it's probably what will be decided on paper. The difficulty is that once the PKK is folded back into Damascus, and the Russian coalition, it'll start being used, or at least will be held out tacitly as a way to pressure Turkey, as happened in the old days before they expelled Öcalan in '98. It'll be a return to that kind of situation. So it's difficult to know with Turkey whether they see this coming or whether that's how they're viewing it, because they just see the PKK as an urgent problem on the border. They are willing to accept Assad returning, even if the price is that the regime acquires this new instrument to pressure them, or this newly powerful instrument to pressure them down the line.
Now, if this does end up the reality in northeast Syria, I wonder what it might mean for the anti-ISIS fight, with different areas controlled by different parties that don't communicate much or haven't historically in recent years had strong relations. A New York Times report yesterday, on Monday, detailed how ISIS is already beginning to make considerable gains since the start of Turkey's offensive. What are your thoughts?
I think it's an inevitable part of it. It's a part of the problem with the whole paradigm of counterterrorism, is that it's this attempt to run a counterterrorism war in Syria separate from the underlying political conflict. It contained the seeds of its own destruction. It couldn't even be successful on the narrow counterterrorism lines. And I think this is another example of that, because it was, as I say, the inevitability of Turkey's incursion here or attempt to dismantle the PKK statelet is just one of those facts that has to be dealt with. So it was always coming. But even in the smoothest case of a transition between one set of ruling authorities and another one, you would have had gaps that ISIS would have exploited. And obviously this is far from a smooth transition. So that ISIS will have even more space to play. I think the other fact is that it's not really to do with either Turkey or the PKK or Assad, is just that ISIS is stronger than it was at the start. So ISIS is probably as powerful as it was in about 2013 or something, when it was on the upswing, but before it tried to create this caliphate. So ISIS was underground and is out of sight, but was more powerful than it had been in, say, after the defeat of 2008.
Wow. So you're saying ISIS right now is about 2013 ISIS?
I'd say so. It's hard to get an exact grip on it, but it's more in the 2012, 2013 range than it is after 2008, 2009.
And it's being given more room to play. So that suggests we should expect something of an ISIS resurgence in the next year or two.
I think so. It depends what we mean by resurgence. I mean, I think the grabbing of territory is something that they are just strategically decided not to do, or not for any length of time. I think there may be a moment at some point in the next year or two where they grab, say, a town or a city in eastern Syria and hold it for a short while and then pull out, just to, in a sense, show that they can. I think that's not off the table as a possibility. But I don't think that they're going to try for the caliphate anytime soon, a sort of a restore.
Because that makes them just such an obvious target.
Yeah, but the Assad control in eastern Syria, so the areas of Deir ez-Zor that are formally under regime control are very fragile, and I don't know that they can really defend themselves if ISIS chose to make a go at them. But yeah, there will be space in this transition for even more.
Mm-hmm. General Joseph Votel and Elizabeth Dent, a former counterterror official at the State Department, wrote in The Atlantic on Monday that the U.S. could continue to fight ISIS in Syria mainly by working with allies to reinforce borders and using intelligence assets to monitor ISIS movement, and then also even making airstrikes from Syrian airspace with Russian approval. Does this seem feasible to you?
It's a lot to hang on the Russians, isn't it? Especially since the Russians have proven willing to sort of use ISIS when they see fit. I mean, when the Russian intervention started in Syria, they left ISIS alone in the east and went after the mainstream opposition in the west. And Assad's manipulated ISIS all along the way to divide and destroy the rebellion. So leaving sort of US interests in the hands of the Russians seems like a very bad idea, just as a general rule. I assume there are ways to do this in a cross-border way from Iraq, assuming the Iraqis don't throw the American troops out, which there are powerful, particularly pro-Iran aligned forces trying to do. But it all seems a bit small. It's once you lose the control of the ground, you lose the real sense of what's going on and what's happening, and you're just bound to be surprised, I think. But if this is the fallback position, I suppose it's some use that they can get out of their positioning, but it seems doomed not to be very successful.
Mm-hmm. Trump has warned that he would obliterate Turkey's economy if it does anything, quote, off limits. And the State Department warned that the U.S. would impose significant costs if Turkey acted, quote, inhumanely. The reported roadside executions and use of white phosphorus by Turkey-backed rebels would seem to cross that line. In your view, is Turkey able to maintain some control and discipline over these rebel allies?
No, not as much as it would like to or should be able to, which is the problem. It's actually a bit of a mystery to me why they've allowed these people we knew after Afrin the nature of them and what they would do. It's a bit of a mystery why Turkey has allowed them to front this, given that they knew there'd be so much international attention on it. My assumption is it must be to do with minimizing their own casualties, and possibly some effort at a kind of legitimacy is to say this is Syrians fighting for their own territory and we're just helping, rather than a Turkish operation. But I think it was kind of inevitable that this is what would happen if they went in with those forces. As for the US, I don't know if we should call it a red line on what Turkey's conduct would be. It's distinctly hazy what they mean by this. I mean, Trump's statement that, after all, Trump basically green-lighted this. No, basically, he did green-light this in full public view, and has then spent the last 2 weeks denying that's what he did.
And then said, denying it also.
Yeah, so it's just one of those. That's a broader point about this whole situation, is that the US policy is just completely incoherent. Even internally, there's no sense day to day of what the US policy is or what's going to happen.
But just go back to Turkey's partnership with these rebels. My sense is that they didn't really have any alternative, and they didn't want to commit all. It would have required so many more Turkish troops if they went alone, right?
The assumption is that would have been it was just a commitment of resources that they didn't want to make.
Okay. I think that's all I have for you today. Anything else we might discuss? Anything I missed that you'd like to mention?
I don't think so. I think we covered it.
Okay, great. Kyle Orton, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.